Quiet on the set, please.
Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
And action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Welcome, everyone, to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign podcast. Steve, we mentioned a couple of episodes ago that you and I have been reading a lot of fabulous books about the entertainment industry.
So many great books.
Last week, we talked to TCM host Dave Karger on our 100th episode about his book, Oscar Night, Iconic Stars and Filmmakers on Their Career-Defining Wins, which is a fabulous book. And this week, we get to speak to someone that has just a fascinating story to tell, and that fellow TCM Film Festival goers will know from this previous festival, as she was one of the people that introduced a film.
So our guest today is Dr. MARSHA Gordon. And MARSHA's a film professor, an author, a filmmaker, and to me, she's like a cultural historian whose work explores this intersection of film and gender equality and really American history. She's been a film studies professor at North Carolina State University in Raleigh since 2002, and she is the author of Film is Like a Battleground, Sam Fuller's War Movies, and Hollywood Ambitions, Celebrity in the Movie Age. She's the co-editor of Learning with the Lights Off, a reader in educational film, and Screening Race in American Non-Theatrical Film. She's also the former editor of the Moving Image Journal.
And today we're going to be talking to her about her acclaimed book, Becoming the Ex-Wife, The Unconventional Life and Forgotten Writings of Ursula Parrott. And this is where MARSHA, or Dr. Gordon,
please call me MARSHA.
or Dr. MARSHA.
Dr. MARSHA.
Where MARSHA resurrects the compelling story of Ursula Parrott, who was once a best-selling author in the 20s and 30s, best known for her novel, The Ex-Wife, which captured the anxieties and freedoms of modern womanhood in the Jazz Age. Through MARSHA's meticulous archival research, she not only uncovers Parrott's largely forgotten literary career, but also she explores those broader cultural forces that shaped and ultimately obscured Parrott's legacy. So with Becoming the Ex-Wife, MARSHA offers a vital feminist reappraisal, which I think is so important right now, of this complex figure whose life and work illuminate the evolving roles of women in literature and film and in society at large.
And I first heard MARSHA speak at this year's TCM Film Festival when she introduced Ursula Parrott's film, The Divorcee, which of course, film buffs will know that's what Norma Shearer won her Oscar for. So we're just thrilled to have her with us today. So welcome, MARSHA.
Welcome.
Thank you. That was quite an introduction. I hope I can live up to that in some way.
We're certain that you will.
I know. To kind of get things started, when we have a guest on, we love to hear their origin story with classic cinema. Yeah. What made you fall in love with it? What was it about cinema that drew you in?
Well, this has to begin with a confession, which is that I'm a Valley girl. So I grew up in the Canoga Park, West Hills area of Southern California, just outside of LA. And so I was always Hollywood adjacent and aware of the industry. But, like so many people who grew up in the 70s and 80s, I saw a lot of classic movies on television, so every Thanksgiving it was The Wizard of Oz. I remember seeing Casablanca. My dad loved Westerns. So whenever John Ford was coming on, we'd watch Westerns together. Hitchcock films. I'm sure that the first time I saw so many of these things was on the great kind of television programming of movies that we had in Los Angeles, both on the networks and then also on those kind of one-off stations that we used to get back in the day with the rabbit ears. And
right.
Yeah, it was also a time of, video stores. So we'd go to the video store and, my mom would be like, okay, you can get 3 VHS tapes. And I was drawn to a lot of the older movies from a fairly young age. And, this is also partly a confession, a slightly embarrassing confession. But, I remember seeing Rebel Without a Cause for the first time. I was probably 10 or something, 11. And, that is such an extraordinary film. This is the Nicholas Ray film, of course, with James Dean, which, at the time, that was probably the reason I was watching that film over James Dean. But that film and all of Nick Ray's films are so sympathetic to young people and to that angst you feel when you're growing up and you feel like a misfit in the world. And so I also remember, feeling like these films were speaking to me, even as a Valley girl, like in a different time and place.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, given that, Marsha, do you have a favorite genre of classic film? And within that, or even if it's outside of that, do you have a favorite actor or actress that you love from the classic cinema?
This is a very cruel question. Favorites are so hard.
Really?
I mean, for any film buffs and film historian in particular, but okay, I'll say a couple things here. One is I love film noir. I mean, how can you not love film noir? It's kind of impossible. And, when I think about films like Double Indemnity and Mildred Pierce, Out of the Past, I think these are perfect films.
Yes.
The performances, the aesthetics, the stories, the sense of time and place. It's just, these are films that really resonate with me and that I think bear watching and rewatching. And I love teaching them because students today can still appreciate those films. And I also love screwball comedies. I mean, Bringing Up Baby, anything by Preston Sturges. I mean, we need humor, as we all know. We need humor, and I think the kind of screwball comedies of, particularly the 30s and the 40s were just so good. In terms of actresses, Bette Davis has always been like, I have a soft spot for Bette Davis. I love her command of the screen. And then also, I love her story. I remember I found a copy of her autobiography at a used bookshop when I was a PhD student at the University of Maryland. And I read that book, which, talks about her contract disputes with Warner Brothers and trying to fight to have some control over her career. And I just thought, wow, this is a really interesting, powerful woman who was working within this really interesting, powerful system, the studio system. So she's a favorite. And then if I could just say one more, I also have a real soft spot for Ida Lupino.
Oh, yes.
Had a tremendous acting career, especially at Paramount, and then transitioned into being, an independent director at a time when that was an unusual thing, and to be a female independent director, in this time period, late 40s and 1950s, and she had a successful television career. I think her films, great favorites like Hitchhiker, I think is phenomenal, and The Bigamist, which is a really complicated movie about bigamy. These are great films that everyone should see if they get the opportunity.
Well,
and she directed episodes of Gilligan's Island, so I love her.
Yes, so much television. She was prolific.
You chose as well people that are not only amazing artists, but really trailblazers, in terms of the boundaries that they've been pushed through. And I think of Bette Davis now as how she's helped people that are around today, even though we don't have the studio system. She certainly is an example of, not accepting what you're given.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting to look at those figures over the course of Hollywood history. Actually, the book I'm currently writing is a biography of Dorothy Arzner, who was another one of those figures. I mean, she was the only woman who was consistently directing films in Hollywood for the studios in the period of the late 1920s and 1930s and into the 1940s. And she was the only woman.
Yeah.
And she had an extraordinary career and did amazing things, especially with strong female actresses like Clara Bow, for example.
Yes.
And so I am definitely drawn to those figures who were kind of pushing up against, what was considered allowable, acceptable, or even possible.
Yeah.
Now, Marsha, since 2002, you have been a film professor at North Carolina State. What types of courses do you teach, and do you get a say in what types of things you present?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first off, one of the wonderful things about being a professor, especially at a Research One institution like North Carolina State, is that I have a complete autonomy over what I teach in my classes, and
Oh,
we have
wow.
to work within what our schedules require. But I have been so fortunate to get to teach so many different classes that are passion classes. Like I taught a class once on Warner Brothers, the history of the studio through the
Oh,
1950s. I've taught classes on the musical. I've taught classes. I called one class Cinema Stylists, and it was uh, Douglas Sirk and Sam Fuller, two of my favorite filmmakers who I didn't
yes.
mention, but I should have. There's just too many.
There's too many.
And to introduce students to filmmakers like Fuller and Sirk, who they're probably not going to encounter in other ways, and then to see them falling in love with these directors, to see a room full of jaded 20-somethings go like crazy with love for a Douglas Sirk melodrama of the
Oh, I love
1950s
that.
is
Yes.
one of the best feelings I've ever had in my life. And so, so I've taught classes I did actually a class a couple of years ago where I took my comfort zone, which is like classical Westerns, and then I put that next to their comfort zone, which is superhero films. So those are two versions of the same story, like men and
Yeah.
mythology and all of these kinds of ideas, and what is America, et cetera. And so they studied kind of the antecedents in the genre of the Western, and then we were able to look at superhero films, and I was able to say to them, these are your films, not mine, right? Like you tell me how they fit into this story of American film history. So
What a clever exercise. What a great way to, lure them in, sort of.
yeah, right. I know and of course, and then they end up watching the Westerns, especially the ones from the 1950s, and they recognize all the mythologies and all of the ideas that are just reiterated in the superhero films in a different
Yeah.
way.
You touched on your work on your new book, which is on Dorothy Arzner,
Yeah.
and the interest in female directors in general. Lois Weber, Elise Guy Blaché. Do you feel, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'd love for you to talk about it, that they're as well documented as they should be, and that people know about them like they should?
Well, thanks for teeing off a softball question. I think I can hit this one. That would be a hard no. I mean, I was thinking about this with Arzner. There's a wonderful book about Dorothy Arzner, an academic book by a scholar named Judith Main that came out 20 or so years ago, but she's never had a biography. And I think, how many biographies are there of Alfred Hitchcock and John Ford and,
Yes.
all of these very well-known male directors? And it's not that they don't deserve it. It's just that I think that there's space to talk about some of the other directors, especially ones like Arzner, who were so unique and pioneering. Yes. And so it is extraordinary to me how much of film history, especially revolving women's roles behind the camera, right? Female stars we know plenty about, how many of those stories are just not told. And there's a really extraordinary website that your listeners may be interested in. It's called the Women Film Pioneers Project. And it's out of Columbia University. I've contributed a couple of essays to that. And it's a website that tries to chronicle the history of women's participation in the early film industry. So women editors, women camera operators, women directors, women producers. And it's like an attempt to have a kind of paper trail for a lot of these figures that just got written out of the film histories, which were largely written by men in the first generations of American film history. And there were certainly some people, Anthony Slide comes to mind, who were trying to tell the stories of the women who were working behind the camera. But I think a lot of those stories just kind of got excised and then got forgotten.
So that sort of leads me to, I know you talked about Columbia, but is it difficult in writing this book and in trying to resurrect what happened to actually find sources at this point? Is it too late?
That's a great question. And in some ways, this is related. I can speak to this through the lens of both Ursula Parrott and then the current work I'm doing on Dorothy Arzner, which is that, if you are not considered important, nobody's trying to save your legacy, right? So nobody's going after. So that in Parrott's case in particular, and I know we'll be talking about her in a little bit, but she died penniless and obscure, and so nobody was there to like catch her papers. Well, luckily there were a couple of important people who did keep correspondence from her, and so I was able to access those things. Now, Arzner's case is interesting. Arzner was a lesbian, and her life partner, Marion Morgan, who was a choreographer, including incredible work that she did in Hollywood films. So she took her dance troupe and ended up working in Hollywood. Their lives were necessarily secret, right? Their personal lives, even though they built homes together in the Hollywood Hills and in Palm Springs. And so the same kind of public records, I mean, certainly there's no marriage records or anything like that you might find with a heterosexual female figure from this period. But, even kind of personal correspondence, things like home movies, I mean, these things don't exist in the same way as they might for other Hollywood figures. So I think there is some extra work involved. And so many of the great kind of storytelling about directors has emerged from when people are able to interview people who knew them, right? So I'm coming to this Arzner project, really 20 years too late, because so many people who worked with Arzner are gone. And so I've been very fortunate. I've been able to interview a number of her former students because she taught at UCLA after she retired from the film industry. But I wish there were 100 more people. She worked with so many people. So I do think that there are some extra challenges that have to do with both the nature of these people's lives and also their kind of relationship to, what is famous and well-known and important, and people are scrambling to kind of protect. And in the case of Arzner, for example, her first 3 films are lost. So I have been Fashions for Women, Manhattan Cocktail, and the 10 Modern Commandments are all considered lost films. And it would be extraordinary if one of them showed up. But they probably, I'm told that it's a pipe dream.
Right. Well, before we get into chatting about your book and more about Ursula Parrott, let's share with our listeners this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
Well, the pop quiz question today, in honor of MARSHA with us today, of course, Ursula Parrott's novel, The Ex-Wife, was sold to MGM and turned into the movie The Divorcee, for which star Norma Shearer won her one and only Oscar. However, Shearer was not the first choice to play the lead role. Who did Irving Thalberg initially want to star in the film?
Ooh. All right, that's a great question. We'll be right back with the answer and more with MARSHA Gordon after this.
Okay, Steve and Ann will be right back, but first another stop on the Hollywood tour. Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan were close friends and frequent collaborators in the movies. They made 4 films together. Next Time We Love, 1936, which Steve, Nan, and Marcia will talk about coming up. The Shopworn Angel, 1938, The Shop Around the Corner, 1940, and The Mortal Storm from 1940. Now, The Shopworn Angel somewhat mirrors the real-life relationship of Sullivan and Stewart. You see, they'd been friends for years, having met in the same theater troupe in the early 1930s. Now, reportedly, Stewart fell in love with Sullivan, and while she adored Stewart, she kept falling in love with and marrying other people, including director William Wyler, Stewart's very good friend Henry Fonda, and good friend talent agent Leland Hayward. Stewart credited Sullivan with helping him develop his formidable acting skills for film. And now, back to Steve and Ann and their very special guest, MARSHA Gordon, from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everybody. Before we get further into MARSHA Gordon and her incredible book, we want to give a shout out to our listener of the week. And this week, we're honoring Dave Churchill from Florida. Dave is also a writer, and he's recently released this moving, funny, very powerful book called Live to Tell, a celebration of friends lost to AIDS. It's a wonderful book, and Dave's a great writer. So, Dave, thank you for being such a supportive fan of ours, and so quick to share our post and to like everything, and just all the great suggestions and all the great support.
Thank you, Dave. So, MARSHA, let's talk now about Ursula Parrott and the book, the wonderful book that you wrote. Can you tell us when you were first introduced to the writings of Ursula Parrott and what got you interested in her?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question for a number of reasons because it was such an accidental discovery. I had been tipped off to the existence of some unproduced F. Scott Fitzgerald screenplays that he wrote for MGM in the 1930s that were acquired, oddly enough, by the University of South Carolina Special Collections Library because there was a Fitzgerald scholar at University of South Carolina. And so was invited to give a talk at USC in 2015. And I remembered, there's these screenplays. And so I sent an email to Special Collections and I said, look, I have like 2 hours between events. Can I pop over and see these Fitzgerald screenplays? And they said, sure. So I showed up and they said, okay, well, here's the 3 titles. Which one do you want to look at? Because you only have a couple hours. And I was like, I'll take Infidelity for the win, please. That sounds like a good one. And if you're going to pick something, pick a good title.
Saucy title.
Exactly. So I open this folder and like one of the first things I see is that it's based on a story by a woman named Ursula Parrott. And I was like, I wrote, who is Ursula Parrott? Wrote her name, underlined it. And I read the screenplay, quickly, and I was like, this is pretty interesting. This is a story about adultery and forgiveness. And by the way, they could not make Infidelity despite working on it for months because it was a film about adultery that ended with mutual forgiveness and reconciliation, which did not fit the production code, right? Which is like, someone's got to die. Or
you must be punished for your bad behavior.
Of course. Wow.
Yeah. And then, they tried to spin it. They actually tried to rename it Fidelity even, which is like a classical move on the studio's part. And, the Hayes office was not buying that either. But anyhow, so I actually spent almost 2 years thinking I was going to write a book about these Fitzgerald screenplays. And it's like talking to the studios, trying to figure out who owned the rights and could I republish the screenplays. And as part of that, I started doing research on Ursula Parrott. And I bought a copy of a book that was out of print off of eBay, and it was called Ex-Wife. And the book came, and I thought, well, I probably don't have to read this, but let me just pick it up. And I read it in a single, sitting. It was just, I could not believe that this book came out in 1929, that I had never heard of it. And I started asking my friends who were scholars of American literature and women's literature. Okay, so tell me what you know about Ursula Parrott. Nobody had heard of her. And, I looked up in all my research databases. Nothing had been written about her except for a master's thesis like 25 years ago. And I thought, this is pretty interesting. I started digging around, and the more I learned about her and her, 20 books and over 100 and something short stories and nonfiction articles and her very colorful life, I thought, what the world doesn't need is another book about F. Scott Fitzgerald. And what the world does need is a book about Ursula Parrott. This gets back to our earlier conversation.
Yes,
absolutely.
Do we need another Hitchcock book? I don't
know.
I know. She's probably considered, I think, like an early feminist writer. How do you think her work holds up today?
Well, it's so interesting because when I started this project, as I said, Ex-Wife, I had to buy a used copy on eBay. And the month after my biography of Parrott came out, McNally Editions republished Ex-Wife. This was like kismet. This was not anything I arranged. I knew about it, but not, until, 6 months before the publication. And since then, it's been translated into like 7 languages. Now it's like French, Dutch, Italian, German, Spanish.
Wow. I think you should take total credit for that. I really do.
I wish that I could.
You resurrected her.
Well, I am part of, I think, the zeitgeist, right?
Yeah,
Which is, is getting to your question, is how does it resonate today? And one of the fun things has been to kind of follow it on social media, like to look at hashtags for Ursula Parrott on Instagram and to see people posting, their book covers from all over the world and talking about, oh my gosh, this book, it's amazing. Why didn't I read this? And, when I was on my book tour and I was traveling all over the country talking about Ursula Parrott and showing some of the movies that were made from her work, it was the young people. And by young, I mean 20 and 30 something who would come up to me after the events and go, why was I not taught this in high school? Like, why did I have to read The Great Gatsby 4 times every year? And why didn't I get this? And this book is so incredible. I'm telling all my girlfriends to read it. It's the Sex and the City of,
Of the
1929.
Yes.
And it is. And so I think that the question of feminism is slightly more complicated because on the one hand, Ursula Parrott, through her word and deed, was very, very feminist. But she did not identify with feminism. She dismissed it and she wanted to distance herself from it. But that was in the context of this like 1920s backlash to, the feminist movements of the kind of first wave of feminism that got women the vote, et cetera. And there's a whole kind of complex thing with Parrott and thinking about things like women's education and careers and family and having to kind of juggle everything and do it perfectly and it just all being too much that I think really resonates with young people today, right? We are all like feeling like, how do we do all of these things that we're supposed to do and do them well? And it's a lot of pressure. And so Parrott was kind of thinking through these things as they were happening in the culture, right? So she was kind of like reporting through her fiction and through her nonfiction. She was telling stories that were kind of dramatizing the complexities of modernity for women in particular.
Wow.
Before we get into the film adaptations and really her work, I want to talk about her life a little bit because this woman lived a colorful life. I mean, marriages, rapes, abortions, arrests. I mean, I said it before we started. She was the Susan Lucci of the jazz age. Can you tell us about her life, a little bit about her biography behind the scenes?
Absolutely. I mean, first off, her life should be a movie. This is a story. If there's any screenwriters listening, this is a story for you. You don't have to make anything up. It's all there in the story. So
true.
She was born in Boston in 1899 and raised in a Catholic family doctor's house. She went to Radcliffe College, so she's part of not the first generation of college-educated women, but in the vanguard. So her family really valued the idea of the young women in the family getting educations, and then she got married young. She dropped out of grad school at Radcliffe actually to get married and have a child and elope to Greenwich Village, New York City, where so many of her stories are set. She ended up having a child. It was not planned. And that marriage fell apart to her first husband, Lindsay Parrott, who was went on to become a very well-known reporter and editor for the New York Times. And so from the ashes of her first marriage and from the experience of having to raise a son basically on her own and to work, which she started working, writing advertising copy in New York City for department stores. She kind of rekindled her love for writing. She was an English major. She liked writing, and she wrote this book, Ex-Wife, which was originally published anonymously in 1929 as a marketing gimmick, and then her name attached to it soon after. And her career just kind of took off overnight. And then, yes, she lived a big, complicated life, made millions of dollars, spent millions of dollars, 4 marriages, 4 divorces, unbelievable. She was a female pilot. She was a world traveler. She once sprung a young sergeant out of a military stockade. He was under arrest for marijuana dealing in New York City, and he was in a minimum security stockade in Miami during World War II, by the way. This was a headline story. So she went big, and she struggled with alcoholism like so many writers of the jazz age and so many people who worked in this industry and went between New York and Hollywood. And so she also had really, really low points in her life. So she experienced a lot in her 50-something years on this earth.
Yeah.
She wrote her books or short stories were the source material for I believe, is it 10 films? So, Marsha, what are your favorite adaptations of those 10 films? And some of them, are they even available to be seen? I'm assuming you've seen all of them, but
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure our listeners would love to see some of the more obscure ones.
Yeah. Well, so my two personal favorites are The Divorcee and Next Time We Love. And so just to say a couple things about The Divorcee, that's the one out the gate. So ex-wife, MGM scoops up the rights to ex-wife. It becomes The Divorcee. There's a couple of great stories around this, which I recounted to the audience at Turner Classic Movie Fest this past April. One is that Norma Shearer really wanted the role, but Irving Thalberg thought that maybe it was a little too racy for his wife.
His wife, yeah.
Yes.
And so she was playing like more modest characters. And so there was a
Or Marie
photographer.
Antoinette, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So there was a photographer who had recently come to town and just had started taking pictures. His name was George Harrell. You might have heard of him.
Yeah.
And so she had Harrell take pictures of her, including some like super smoking sexy pictures and some negligee. And she left them on her husband's desk. And, you know, the rest is herstory, as they say, since she got the role and got her only Academy Award for basically playing a version of Ursula Parrott, by the way, because Parrott was always writing these kind of semi-autobiographical stories. So that must have been an unusual experience to kind of see Norma Shearer become her on screen. So this is a film that was released in the beginning of the Depression. It was a massive hit, made the theaters that played it tons of money, did great with the studios, for the studio, for MGM. And so it meant that Ursula Parrott was super hot stuff, right? She was getting these big paychecks, and she was able to kind of broker her celebrity and come to Hollywood and work in town for a while, writing stories for a number of different studios. She was assigned to Claudette Colbert out of the Paramount office in New York for a little while. So anyhow, it really was kind of this gateway to the world of Hollywood, which, by the way, no shade on any Hollywood denizens, but she hated it there.
Yes.
she thought it was too sunny, and as she called people in Hollywood some of the like best dressed and least cultured people in the world. Sorry, Hollywood.
I know. I loved reading that part of your book where her assessment of Hollywood was very interesting.
Yeah, she did not love it. But so the Divorcee, the other thing that I really love about the Divorcee, and I've shown this to audiences all over the country, especially on college campuses, young people love this movie. They get so upset about it tells the story of adultery and then the way the film tells it, reconciliation, which, by the way, does not happen in the book, needless to say.
Yeah.
But the husband, is such a creep. And when he does what he does and says what he says in the book, I mean, audiences will boo and hiss at the screen. It is really kind of fun to see that sense of like, wait a second, she's being honest with you. She's a good woman.
Yes.
Don't ruin your marriage for one indiscretion when you've done it too.
I know. What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Exactly. So if you have not seen The Divorcee, listeners, please go see The Divorcee. That one is fairly easy to get a hold of. But one of the exciting things that happened around Turner Classic Movie Fest is that UCLA worked with the Packard Humanities Institute to strike a new 35 millimeter print of that film. So now it can be seen on 35 millimeter again. So if anyone does any 35 millimeter programming out there, just know The Divorcee is available.
Oh, that's fantastic. I didn't know that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So my second favorite, Next Time We Love, this is such a special film. I money back guarantee you loving this film. So this is Jimmy Stewart's first starring role, first of all. Margaret Sullivan. This came out in 1936. And it's based on a book called Next Time We Live that Parrott wrote. And the studio changed it to Next Time We Love because they didn't want people to think it was about reincarnation. I'm not kidding.
Because that would be very confusing.
Yeah, that's where my mind goes. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is a film and a story about a dual career couple. So husband and wife, 1930s, newspaper reporter, stage actress, and she ends up vastly outperforming her husband. And it is about what happens when the woman in the marriage is more successful than the man. And it puts this horrible strain on their marriage. They end up having to live apart. And it's not a film in which there's really judgment or like kind of negative assessment of the female character. It's really just about like, this is hard. Like it's actually hard for both of us to have careers and to have a child on top of it. And so it's really, it's a very, very special film. It's not seen very widely. I mean, a lot of people I know who really know Hollywood have not seen Next Time We Love. So try to seek that out. Another film of hers that I just absolutely love, which you will not be able to see, most likely, it's called Leftover Ladies. Okay. This is such an interesting film because it's Tiffany Pictures, which is a B movie studio, who releases this film in 1931. I'm not entirely sure why Parrott decided to sell this film to Tiffany, because obviously you're working with MGM. Why are you dipping into the world of the bees? Except that she always needed money, and so it might have come at the right time. And Leftover Ladies is actually based on a piece of nonfiction writing that Parrott did that was talking about what's happening to women who want to have careers and marriages at the same time. What's life like in an age of divorce and all of these other questions that she's grappling with. And so Leftover Ladies is this low budget film that is so fun. Roscoe Cairns is in it, Marjorie Rambeau, Claudia Dell. And it's just like this trashy, fun, fast-paced, nonsensical, it's got like too much drinking and sex and a suicide and all these things that, great 1931 B movie. But there's only one surviving print of it in the world, and that is at the Library of Congress. And I was actually able to introduce, to my knowledge, the only time that film has ever been shown in public since this time period was when I introduced it at the Billy Wilder Theater at UCLA when my book came out. So Library of Congress allowed us to project it. And I thought there was a possibility of it coming out on DVD, but it hasn't. So again, if there's any DVD producers listening. This is a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic. Amazing.
Do I have time for one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so then my last, but it's not my least favorite because it's so good, is a film that actually your listeners might have seen, but might not have connected with Ursula Parrott. And it's a film that was actually made twice. And if you're familiar with it, it's probably the Douglas Sirk version. It's There's Always Tomorrow.
Yes.
Came out in 1956. Barbara Stanwyck and Fred McMurray, two of my favorites, and especially Barbara Stanwyck, who's so
and Joan
fantastic.
Bennett, too.
Joan Bennett. So as Universal was wont to do, this was a film that they had made in the 1930s, originally with Frank Morgan, by the way, and Alan Hale and Benny Barnes. And then they remade it again in the 50s. They were doing that right and left, and Cirque did a bunch of these remakes. And I'm so blown away by the way this film is navigating the ideas that Parrott had about the 1930s and about a career woman, right? Barbara Stanwyck's character, who never had time for marriage because she was too busy pursuing a career. And then she starts thinking about maybe I should have thought about getting married and having kids. And she, goes back to visit Fred McMurray and his little suburban life, which is actually a terrible life. He's miserable, right? His kids are
bratty kids.
horrible, the worst children in Hollywood history outside of Mildred Pierce.
Yeah.
We just featured them on an episode about bratty Hollywood kids.
Really?
Yeah, we did.
That's awesome. Who's worse than those kids then? So you've got Mildred Pierce, you've got There's Always Tomorrow.
We have the Patty McCormick in The Bad Seed.
Oh yeah, that's pretty bad. That's extreme. Yeah. Anyhow, and so it's interesting to see the way that this story kind of gets spun in a post-war suburban America, right? Because it was originally told in a 1930s post-Depression era environment. And reviews of the film when it came out are so interesting. Some of them talked about the fact that it was so refreshing to see a film instead of being about neglected women, it was about a neglected man. Right.
Oh,
Which
yeah.
I think is really cool when you think about how many films are there like that tell that story. And that came from the source. That was Parrott. That was her imagination. And it was the last film so far. Maybe one day someone will do a remake. I certainly think the Divorcee could be spun into something very interesting and contemporary. But anyhow, so that was the last film that was actually made from her work in 1956. And she died not long after.
Yeah, it's such a good one.
Yeah, I wanted to touch base on something that struck me from reading your book last night. For all her feminist ideas and all of, the things she did to promote, female empowerment and equality and gender equality, there's this character that keeps popping up named Hugh O'Connor, which was her, I think, the man she truly, truly loved. And it was almost became an obsessive love.
Yeah.
Do you think that she was trying to find that ideal of marriage and family and all the things that society tells you should want with the career woman and being the modern woman? Do you think she ever reconciled that? And how did Hugh play into all of that? Does that make sense?
It does. So a couple of things. So Hugh O'Connor was her lover after her first divorce, or actually maybe before her first divorce, but not because she was married and having an affair with him, because it took her a while to get her first divorce. Yeah. And he was really the great love of her life, and he was married and eventually got divorced and eventually got remarried, but not to her. But he was also a journalist. She had a thing for journalists.
She did.
And they had their correspondence survives. So I wish I had correspondence between her and her first husband, because I could understand the nature of that relationship much better. I know much more about her and Hugh. And they had a very interesting correspondence and an interesting relationship. I mean, it was troubling in many ways. I don't think he was very kind to her. But she really used her letters to him to try to work through kind of her ideas about what it meant to live in an age of divorce, where women had to kind of stay on the kind of marketplace of femininity while they were also trying to work and figure out how to support themselves. Trying to figure out what it just meant to be a man or a woman in this period where so much was being upended. And I like to say about Ursula Parrott that, and she is a relentless optimist. This is a woman who kept getting married and kept getting engaged. And she kept saying, like, I just want to be with someone who, will respect that, like, I'm raising my son on my own. I don't want a substitute father for my son. I'm perfectly fine raising him on my own. And she, in fact, put her son through Harvard, which was the thing she was proudest of. But she did want, like, a partner. I mean, I think she uses the word in one letter. And of course, that's not a concept that existed in the 1930s or 1940s, that
not at all
that in a romantic relationship you have a partner, but it's very much an idea we have today. And I think she was really ahead of her time with that idea, and she couldn't find the right person to enact that with. And she made a lot of really bad decisions. Some of them influenced by alcohol. Some of them, I think, just influenced by a little bit of a mania to try to, like, dig herself out of some tough spots that she was in over the years. So yeah, I do think that it's one of the tragedies is that she never kind of found the right person to kind of co-pilot her life with, because that's what she really wanted.
Yeah, that came across beautifully.
We've been talking now for a bit about this amazing, extraordinary woman, your book, which is certainly shedding a light on her. But Marsha, why do you think that it's taken so long? Why do you think she all but disappeared from really, the 40s on?
Okay, so this is a big question. We could talk about this for a long time, so I'm going to try to make this snappy. Number one, reputations and fame and literary celebrity and even directorial celebrity. These are not things that are just like, they don't just exist. They're made by gatekeepers and by people who who assure that figures are kept in the public imagination. And it's hard for me not to compare Parrott and Fitzgerald just because he's so obviously the great American writer of this period. Right. And, people are always surprised to hear Great Gatsby sold a fraction of the copies of Ex-Wife. Yeah. A fraction. But what happened was a couple of things. Fitzgerald had great advocates in powerful places, working at prestigious universities, who wanted to make sure that his novel, which they had a softness for, stayed in the public eye. And so they wrote articles about him. They encouraged, for example, during World War II, when soldiers were overseas, tens of thousands of copies of The Great Gatsby were sent free to soldiers serving during the war. So all these people who came back had read The Great Gatsby, and Gatsby's renaissance really happens after World War II. It's not that the book became famous and stayed famous. And so Parrott had nobody like that. Nobody was tending to her legacy. And, I feel like, when I decided to write this book, it was a little bit of a leap of faith, because I had to ask myself, is anybody going to publish a book about a woman no one's ever heard of who has no books in print? And in point of fact, my agent pitched this to every major press, the big presses, and they all said that they could not risk publishing a book about a figure that nobody had ever heard of. And so I ended up publishing with the trade division of University of California Press, who were so lovely to work with and so invested in helping me resurrect this figure. But it was a lesson in, once you're damned to obscurity, it's really hard to convince people that, it's worth taking the time and energy and resources to bring somebody back. And so I think it's a lot of different things that kind of conspired to make it hard to tell stories about people who are not well known. And, if I had written that book on Fitzgerald, I can tell you that would have been very, very easy to publish with a major publishing house right away. Wow. Because, Fitzgerald, we can sell that all day, every day.
Like knee-jerk reaction, yes.
Right. Yeah. But I think everyone who's trying to write these more kind of challenging stories, because they're not just, easy to recognize, easy to market figures. That's something that we're all up against. And so, it's a little bit of a leap of faith, but I think it's really worth it. And I'm always so thrilled when I get to do podcasts like this or introductions like I did at the Divorcee at TCM Fest to just keep the conversation going, because I think it's like many, 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 many conversations have ripple effects. And,
absolutely.
Now maybe somebody will teach Ex-Wife in their class, and maybe they'll pair it with the Divorcee. And then all of a sudden, Ursula Parrott's writing and the films made by it become part of the kind of cultural vocabulary. And who knows, maybe one day they'll be more read than Gatsby. You never know.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Well, we could talk for hours about this. This is so fascinating. And just her life and her career. And it's just inspired us all. We want to go and watch her movies. And that's what I hope for our listeners.
Great.
But one final question is, what do you hope people take away from Ursula Parrott and her work?
Yeah.
What do you hope her legacy becomes?
I really hope that her legacy was that she was writing very bravely about some pretty scary stuff. Imagine 1929, you've got an Irish Catholic father, family doctor, and you're writing about your divorce, the abortion you experienced. Again, you mentioned rape. This was all in the first novel. And even though, it was not published as memoir, everyone said, oh, well, this is a version of her life. And it was. Yeah. And so I think people, if people recognize her for her courage and her courage to bring up some pretty uncomfortable conversations about marriage, infidelity, careers, salary inequity, all manner of things revolving around kind of women coming out of the home and into the public sphere. That would be really, that's everything that I want.
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, MARSHA, thank you so much for spending this time with us. It really is a fascinating subject. And we do just want to encourage our listeners to pick up a copy of Becoming the Ex-Wife
It's so good, you guys.
You gotta
Go get it.
Thank you, Steve and Nan.
Yes.
So let's share the answer to this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
Okay, and of course the question was, Norma Shearer was not the first choice to play the lead in The Divorcee. Irving Thalberg initially wanted another MGM diva to play the role. Who was it? Marsha, I'll let you answer.
I want to be alone. Greta Garbo.
Greta Garbo was the first person they offered it to, and she declined. And then he got interested in Joan Crawford. And Joan really wanted the role. And when she found out that Norma Shearer was cast, she famously said, "Oh, of course she got it. She's sleeping with the boss."
Oh, Joan. Thanks, everyone, for spending this time with us. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast. And if you'd follow us on social media, our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign. You can find us on Facebook, on Instagram. You can also watch the podcast on YouTube. And if you do that, give us a thumbs up and subscribe.
And we love hearing from you. Please keep those emails coming. You can email us at info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. We're going to put up Marsha's website address in our show notes, so if you guys want to check her out a little further.
Thanks again, Marsha. That's this week's View.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Ann McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review, and tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor Lindsay Schnebley. Associate producer and researcher John Price Ritchie. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2025, all rights reserved. That's a wrap.